I'm Mike Christie from the UK. My background is I'm an environmental economist and I've been largely involved with value and biodiversity across various ranges. I was involved in TEEB and the D0 report. I'm going to talk a little bit about the UK NEA, but I was only marginally involved with that, so it's very much supporting what Ian Bateman and his companions have done. I was more involved with the Welsh assessment, a subcomponent assessment, rather than the full NEA. But I'll talk about the NEA and also talk about another study which I did for DEFRA, looking at the ecosystem service benefits from UK Biodiversity Action Plan. And I think the reason why I'm going to talk about both these issues is that the NEA was very much based on existing values, where the UK BAP was a study I did where we estimated the economic values. So I think in the UK we're quite lucky, we've got lots of values out there, where a lot of other countries around the world, so there's not as much information. So the second study might give you some idea of how you might collect some data in a coherent way. And then I'll try and say something about some lessons we've learned in the UK. So in terms of the background to TEEB type studies, what we're trying to do is estimate largely economic values, although you might not have to go that way, on changes to ecosystem services, and often it's based on different habitats. And we're looking at future scenario changes of those habitats on the impacts on services. So often what we're needing, or we're looking forward to undertake a TEEB-like study, is value estimates on the service delivery from different habitats. And these valuation points may be attained from existing studies, and that was largely the basis for the NEA. Or you might have to do new empirical studies. You might have to go out and collect values, and that's what I did in the UK Biodiversity Action Plan study. So what I'll do is spend like 5-7 minutes on each of these two studies. Hopefully you won't have deja vu when I talk about the NEA. Matt's already mentioned it earlier this morning, and I think Ian Bateman might go into more details in another session later on. So, as you all know, the NEA is now published, and you can get copies of the synthesis report, which has been properly published, and the more technical chapters are on the web, and that's going to be published quite soon. It was led by Ian Bateman, and there was 500 people contributed towards it, but these are our main guys to the synthesis report, but there's a lot more people, including myself, being involved in various aspects of it. In terms of conceptual framework, what TEEB is trying to do, or NEA is trying to do, is look at future changes. So how will future changes impact habitats, and how will that then impact service delivery? So within the UK NEA, we looked at environmental change, social economic change, and political changes, and so forth. And we looked at those changes and how they impact biodiversity and habitats, and then how those habitat changes affect ecosystem services. And then we looked at how those services then impact goods and services delivered to people, and where possible try to evaluate those on impacts on human well-being, and there's kind of whole feedback loops there. So that's kind of conceptual framework. Within the NEA, there were 10 key questions that were addressed. What I'd like to do is just highlight some of the results from 2 of those. The first is looking at the status and trends of UK's ecosystems and services provide. So how has the UK habitats changed in the past, and how might they change in the future? What's the implications for services? And then question 8 is, what's the economic implications of these changes in services? But there are obviously a lot more questions in there, and you'll have to look at the report to find what they concluded from that. So in terms of drivers of change, they looked at 5 changes: so habitat change, pollution, overexploitation of resources, climate change, and invasive species. And they looked, a whole bunch of expert scientists got together and tried to work out what the changes were. And we looked at those changes in terms of different habitats. So there's 8 habitats they looked at in the UK. And the darker shaded areas relate to how much impact those drivers have had on those services since 1940. And the arrows indicate how those drivers are going to affect changes in the future. So things like habitat change and pollution have had large impacts in the past, so there are major impacts on habitat change. But to a certain extent, we've dealt with those, so their impact in the future, we've kind of stabilised, we've dealt with it. Where if you look at climate change, generally in UK, climate change has currently had very little impact on habitats, but in the future, there's potentially going to be big impacts of climate change. A similar exercise was done in terms of services. Again, we've got our different drivers of change. These are lists of provisioning, cultural, regulating, and supporting services. So again, habitat change and pollution has had big impacts, although largely stabilised, where climate change is currently not much impact, but the impacts are likely to significantly increase in the future. And if you combine these changes, I think Matt showed this slide before, looking at the capacity of the different habitats to deliver services. So again, habitats at the top, different types of services. And we're looking at the ability of different habitats to deliver services. So the darker shaded areas mean those habitats have capacity to deliver more of those particular services. And again, the direction of change is related to the arrows. The round circles suggest that we're reasonably confident with our predictions, where there's a number of squares, and that means that there's knowledge gaps, so we're not too sure about that. So as Matt said this morning, quite simple diagrams, but based on lots of hard discussions by various experts and so forth, and there are information gaps. So that was a kind of trend assessment of the current state and trends in UK habitats. The next element was looking at the economic implications of it. So what we looked at is 6 different scenarios for how Britain or UK might be in the future. We looked at those scenarios across 8 habitats, and we looked at 5 services. So although there's a list of about 25 services in the initial list, what we did in UK ecosystem assessment was reduce it down to 5 important services. So one was agriculture output, and that's very much a market output. And then there was climate change impacts, recreation impacts, and urban green space. And the 5th one was on biodiversity, although in the end we didn't end up valuing the biodiversity. So we've got all these things, and I'll go through those in more detail. In terms of how we did the economic assessment, it was based on a spatially sensitive value function, so meta-analysis value functions curve, based on UK data. And I think it's important to stress that you need to think about spatial impacts on values. So if you think about recreation, then a forest next to London is going to have a huge value in terms of recreation potential, where a similar type forest in the north of Scotland is going to have a very low value. So it's very important to include spatial elements within it. Where in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, a tonne of carbon stored in London will have the same value as a tonne of carbon stored in the north of Scotland, so it's maybe less sensitive to spatial elements. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, they had a process model that looked at different land use changes and processes to estimate those values. So in terms of the scenarios, again, a bunch of experts get together and they identified 6 possible future change scenarios. So Green and Present Land was looking at protecting the environment in UK for its own sake. Nature at Work was looking largely implementing an ecosystem services approach. Local Stewardship was looking at protecting and looking in the local areas and getting food from local areas. Go with the flow is like status quo, continue as we are. National Security is suggesting we need to increase self-sufficiency in UK, and World Markets is trying to increase international trade and so forth. So 6 scenarios in terms of habitats, we've discussed them, and for each habitat it's a range of services, but we only looked at 5 of those services. And in terms of the way valuation was done, we looked at the intermediate services and looked at the final goods and services that were delivered and tried to value some of those. And in the assessment, we looked at not only the economic values, but also looked at health values and shared social values. In terms of health and shared socials, we didn't monetize them, but tried to look at indicators of change for those. So in terms of key results, We've got the main ecosystem services, market agriculture output, greenhouse gas emissions, non-market recreation, non-market green urban space. We didn't put economic values and biodiversity. And if you simply look at the, if you only look at market outputs, then it suggests that the national security is the most, gives the most benefits. But if you then aggregate up all the non-market goods, then the most important one is the working with nature, the ecosystems approach. And what's interesting is, if you look at the market value only, the ecosystems approach scenario is the lowest in terms of overall value, and actually a negative value, where we look at the including non-monetary values, and it becomes the best scenario for a future. So I think what that demonstrates is looking at incorporating ecosystem values and the non-market values of ecosystems will give us very different scenarios about how we should manage the landscapes in the future. So there's very different results depending on the methods you use. Okay, so that's UK National Ecosystem Assessment. The second study I want to talk about is a study I did for DEFRA looking at the ecosystem benefits from the UK Biodiversity Action Plan. Oops. So the UK Biodiversity Action Plan is a series of measures to try and conserve and enhance important habitats and species within the UK. So it's a series of actions for these. So there's 65 habitats being identified, although they can be found into more broad habitats. And there are over 1,000 different species. Some species have got individual action plans, where others have got widespread species. So there's actions in the habitat level to conserve a bunch of different species. And what I was charged with doing is trying to evaluate these different habitat and species action plans from an ecosystem service perspective. And what we're trying to do is generate new empirical evidence of these values rather than doing some value transfer issue. So first step we did was look at the level ecosystem services delivered by the UK Biodiversity Action Plan, and that was based on expert opinion. And then we tried to estimate the value, economic value of those services. And I think what was important is we're very much looking at how the policy was delivering enhancements to the services. So rather than saying this habitat is valued at X amount, we're saying what's the contribution of the biodiversity conservation policy to the delivery of services. So in terms of methodology, we had 3 steps. The first was we undertook a choice experiment where we asked members of the public how much they valued the different or the key ecosystem services associated with the policy. The second step was then to look at what we called a weighting matrix. So we asked a bunch of experts to try and allocate how different habitats delivered services, and also how the conservation policy contributed to the service delivery rather than just the habitat itself. And the third step was then combining steps 1 and 2 to try and give an overall assessment, so kind of disaggregating the values. So the first step was